Hi, everyone. Welcome to Design and Dialogue. We have the great pleasure of having Iwan Baan with us today, the world-renowned architectural photographer. Iwan, you know I'm such a fan, and really have to thank you for joining us today. So we're going to have a look at the broad breadth of Iwan's work. We're going to talk about the way that most of the top architects in the world trust Iwan to kind of depict their architecture and almost complete their architecture with his photographs, giving them a sense of place, giving them a sense of narrative, at once capturing the real life conditions of both the site and the environment, the building, but then also the architecture and its reality. So Iwan, I guess we should begin looking at some images, or you know, at least understanding. It's my first question would be why architecture, and how you found yourself photographing in architecture.
I know. Yes, that was for me also not so planned in a way. Let me start sharing the screen, and thanks so much for having me here. That's it's really nice to be part of this great series. Let me see.
I know that you began.
Can you see the screen?
Yeah, we're seeing the screen.
Yeah,
fine.
perfect. Good.
Yeah. No, I was just going to say, I know you began you began shooting in your preteens, I believe, at a very young age. You began using a camera, and then you, of course, studied photography, but then began as a documentary photographer. Is that right?
Yeah, I studied art school photography here in the Netherlands, and for the first years, like I was young when I finished, and I didn't have so much of a focus immediately yet, but was doing more documentary photography, also traveling a lot, and it was in 2005 or end of 2004. Early 2005 that I met Rem Koolhaas here in the Netherlands, kind of through a mutual contact, and from one day to another I was suddenly surrounded by architects, and yeah, that a whole different world opened for me. Yeah, now it's working. I can flip through them. So yeah, one of the first projects when I just met Rem, like it was an interesting time there in the office where they started the construction of CCTV, and I was fascinated by China, what was happening there, this massive building there in the city, which was going to be built. The city around it, parts which get demolished, the enormous amount of migrant workers who come there to that place. And I thought, yeah, that was could be a very interesting documentation for the next 2-3 years maybe, and yeah, that ended into a very long-term project actually.
Well, just to clarify, CCTV is the national national television of China, and the building is in Beijing, correct?
Yes, yeah.
And so was this a project that you proposed to Rem Koolhaas, to OMA?
Yeah, like often, of course, these project gets just documented at the end, but for me, I thought it would be like really interesting to see like how a project like that gets built. Like I imagined there was still a lot of handwork. Like at moments there were like 10,000 construction workers on site. They're all migrant workers. They're coming from outside the city. They have kind of almost a temporary village built around the site where they live, where they do all their sort of daily chores, and where sort of whole different life next to like the sort of flashy architecture life would happen. And I was really interested in that aspect. I hardly knew anything really about architecture at that moment also. So it was more kind of an intuitive feel that I thought it could be an interesting moment in time to see what happens there, how that city would be in a sort of massive transformation also, and yeah, have that kind of more as a story, a background story on the architecture which was rising there at the same
It's
time.
fascinating to to see these pictures and see the migrant workers almost trapped in a network of structure. Just to give it a little more context, CCTV was a very important early millennial building because of the kind of structural heroics of it, right? So this is Rem Koolhaas at his height, I guess you could say. When and it seems like, although it's the beginning of your career, it's really the peak of Rem's impression on the world, in a sense, when this building goes up. I think it's affectionately known as the pajama pants and in China, but it's fascinating because you can see the way that the structure, you have this huge cantilevered corner and this sort of lattice work on all surfaces of the facade. So how many years were you documenting this?
Now, like when they started, like they had the idea to finish in 2008 just for the Olympics, but that became like a hugely dragged out project basically. Around the Olympics, just the exterior shell was basically finished, but then like at that time it was, I think, the second largest office building in the world in square meters. So like there was so much to be finished there, and that it took still a long time. And then there was, of course, all the controversy around it, with the smaller building, the TVCC building next to it, which burned down in 2009, early 2010, I believe, just like basically days before the opening. And then it became very quiet around that whole project. Like the smaller building was still being rebuilt, but it's still not really opened or finished. So still it's a project whenever I go back to Beijing, which I try to document at stages. Of course, like in the beginning I was there like every 6 to 8 weeks almost to photograph the everything what was happening, and that's now of course very slow, but it's still fascinating to once in a while see what's happening, because in a way like it's not still not really finished.
Yeah. And in this regard, I mean, I think of you and your work as very much a collaborator with the architects, like a partner in a sense, because of the importance of the documentation that you're providing. It's almost as if the building isn't complete, and in this case, isn't complete until you're done photographing it. So, can you tell us a little bit about your process? I mean, how you're working?
Yeah, like it's a very intuitive process, and like in a way, like maybe not so much as a partner immediately during the photography part. Like it's also, you try to really discover a place on your own. Like I feel always an architect has worked for such a long time on a project and is so invested in specific views and specific ideas around the project. And as a photographer, you come kind of with a blank slate almost to a site, and um, gets inspiration from basically everything around. And that was also my approach there with CCTV. Like it's not just the architecture, but there were like incredible interesting stories also like around the building, like parts of the city which were demolished, the migrant workers who lived there, sort of their daily routines and everything what was happening around it. So those things are for me equally as important as the architecture itself. And then with a building like this also, like you feel sort of the architecture really coming together already from the very early beginning. Like it has of course such an important shape, and that shape, that direction of where the building is moving in, you see that from the early start. And like that structure stays visible also, like even in the finished product in the finished building. So in that way it was fascinating to follow that full process.
Mm-hmm. Do you see your work, I mean, as kind of twofold? On the one hand, documenting the reality of the architecture, but on the other hand, documenting the kind of real life that's happening around the architecture. When did this kind of concept come to you? Because it's a very different way of looking at buildings.
Yeah, now, like, I think it's also because of my documentary background. Like, you try to tell a story on a place. It's not just like an idealized detail of a project or an abstract image, but I feel like I want to tell a story on a place, on the surroundings, on where something is, what is happening around it, and naturally through that, basically you start talking with people around it. You sort of, photography is like an amazing tool to stick your nose basically in any kind of situation where you don't really belong to, and sort of investigate and see what's happening there and what people do there, ask about people's lives. And what's really interesting is like that people are, when you're interested in them, like they open up also, and like they want to show things, their environments and so, and like one thing leads to another, and that sort of brings you to different places. And that's also like these pictures, for instance, while I was in China there documenting CCTV, I met Jacques and Pierre also, and started doing that also for the Olympic Stadium and like for other projects. So that kind of was an interesting moment, of course, like in China, with like the massive building boom there.
Right.
All the preparations for the Olympics.
Yeah, this is the Olympic Stadium by Herzog de Meuron.
Yeah. And you see these strange juxtapositions of these migrant workers, like having just their daily things, watching TV in the evening after their work, having a little party or so, and then you see these massive structures in the background. So things they've never seen in their lifetime before. They probably can hardly imagine what their what these things will be in the end. So it's like these total different worlds who come together.
The contrast is striking, and it makes me think about the collective action of architecture, right? I mean, we often only see the result, but what your pictures help reveal is how many people are involved and how many lives architecture touches as it comes into reality. So, yeah.
And then, you finish, document kind of all the way through. And for instance, this is one of the images during the opening of the Olympic Games. So what was it, August 8th, 2008, 888, important number for China. And then, you try to be there also at these moments.
Yeah. Incredible. So at this point in your career, I guess it's 2008, you've been working only a few years. All of a sudden, I mean, your work is being requested by architects all over the world. And I mean, from Herzog de Meuron to Rem Koolhaas to SANAA to Toyo Ito to even the new generation, Yale, mass design. I mean, your work in a sense becomes like a brand in collaboration with their brand. And so not to think about it so crassly, but obviously it's a very artistic pursuit. But at the same time, there is something about what you're bringing to the project that I think is fascinating. And you know, can you talk a little bit about that demand from the architecture community?
Of course, there's these long-term collaborations which are really great, of course, like what you mentioned with MAS, for instance, a MAS group in Boston, who are doing all their projects on the African continent, but also like the larger firms like Herzog de Meuron or OMA. And it's really fascinating to see also like their work growing. and how the themes come back in very different settings, in different surroundings, and really create a body of work like together with these architects on the places they create, on what people do there, on how it transforms these cities and these places. And so and yeah, there's always a mix. Like, I'm fascinated with architects who make the most incredible a detailed small project, for instance, like a Japanese architect, Fujimoto or so, who I'm working from the early beginning, but then also like the other side of the spectrum, like these massive new projects like Qatar here, Jean Nouvel or so, where it's a story you can tell on a building, but also like the city around it, and give this sort of larger narrative on a place.
Yeah, yeah. I'm looking here at my hometown, Chicago.
Yeah, 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 and
Recognize.
that's also yeah,
Right
no,
away.
that's also part of what I try to do. Like, that is not so just a kind of close up of a building, but you try to step further and further away and still let the building play a role in an image like that. But yeah, literally go up in the sky in a helicopter and do these aerial shots of cities, of places where the building is really becomes part of a larger organism.
Yeah, the aerial photograph, this kind of ethereal aerial photograph has almost become a signature of yours, Iwan. And I'm curious when you began looking at cities and architecture from this perspective, and what it brings to your work, how it helps communicate.
Yeah, it started early in a way. Like, it was actually in September 2001. Like, I was just out of art school, and I was living at the time in New York, or kind of half between New York and Amsterdam. And I had just like a small commercial job for a Dutch advertising agency who needed aerial shots of New York, of the World Trade Center, of surroundings. So that was actually the first time I was really photographing from the air for them. And that was September 2001. Days before September 11th, on the 10th, I flew back to Amsterdam, and I landed here in Amsterdam, and the towers were gone. So that was a very strange moment, of course, like to be introduced to the city so well from above, and then 2 days later, that's all gone. So, like, basically from that moment on, like, I felt always like it's very important to tell also that aerial perspective in sort of my visual language of a place. Like it, and then like it was only a couple of years later when I started working with architects, I felt it was strange that architects, like, they always look at models, at site plans and everything also from above on a larger scale, and then the finished photographs of a building were always sort of very cropped out the building without any context, without any reference on a place, without people often. So for me, it was kind of a natural thing to introduce that to architects also, like that aerial perspective, but also like what people do in a place, and that's the kind of human story on a place.
Yeah, your work has been described as a kind of antithesis of the mid-century photographers of architecture like Julius Schulman or Hedrick Blessing, right? Where they were looking for this kind of empty, sterile ideal, the building as an object, not the building as something that we occupy, or the environment as something that we live in. And so, you know, maybe it's the times, maybe it's the technology. I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, for me, like, it's also important to show the messiness and the everyday life around it, and like I think through that you can tell also the what makes that building relevant in that city, in that context, and so on. Like, for instance, this one for Toyo Ito, when he asked me to photograph his theater in Tokyo. It's you see it in the left bottom. It's almost like a little puzzle, hard to see it. But like when I first saw the building, I got there. You see this big black steel building, almost tent-like structure, and super precise, but like a very generous, large, sort of almost mysterious object there in the city. Whereas Tokyo in general feels to me always like it's so light, so white, this incredible pixelation, like there's so much visual information around everything. So it kind of the opposite. So I told him immediately, like, yeah, we need to show that contrast also in a way. So like through that aerial perspective, you really tell that, and then you see this amazing, like, pixelated city which just goes on and on and on, and it's all sort of light gray, white, beige, and so, and then this massive, yeah, kind of mysterious object sitting in the middle of it, and that really tells, yeah, a story to me, like what Japan is about, and what Ito also tried to do with the building.
Yeah, it takes me back to architectural education, my own education in architecture, and how, you know, we were so obsessed, and I guess all students are in architecture, obsessed with studying the object, that we often forget that these things are alive in a place, in a city, and they transform over time. You know, I think about how in my furniture, for example, you never get to see how people live with things in the interior. The things are always photographed in an empty room, let's say. But when you zoom out in a city, you obviously see that the city is full of life. And the architecture as an object that you obsessed over is just one small block in the bigger scheme of things. So,
totally. And it was also maybe a little bit for my own mental health in a way, like until March. Of course, the last 9 months have been for me also a little bit different, but until March I was literally every few days in a different part of the world. So for me it's also like was a way to really reconnect with these places and show like where it is and what makes the building unique, what makes the surroundings unique, and why a certain project is in this place and not somewhere else. And I think through that aerial perspective, that's something you can really show, and also like sometimes the strange juxtapositions, or like here Miami, where through that aerial perspective, you show also the strangeness and absurdity of the place, where it literally sits like just inches above water, and it really seems to float there on the water. And it's also one of these places which will have a very difficult time, I feel, in the next decennia with the climate change.
So that image, a number of questions come up, right? First, the way that the landscape blends with the horizon, and you kind of lose a sense of you know, where the horizon starts and ends, makes me think about where in your work, your personal project and the client's brief starts and ends. Obviously, you know, you've been all over the world on assignment, but while you're there, I suppose you take the opportunity to shoot your own pictures. And so
totally.
Tell us a little bit about the difference between, let's say, what you're asked to accomplish as a documentary architectural photographer and what you'd like to accomplish independently.
Yeah. Now, for me, like, I think that assignment is always very open and very broad. Like, luckily, the people I work with, they give me kind of open brief. They say, you want to just go there and figure it out. And I like that also. I want to be inspired by a place and discover it in a way also myself. And I feel that, coming with this kind of blank slate, like you're open to everything around it, and you're not as you said, like as an architect, you're completely obsessed about the object, and like you try to be influenced by everything around it.
And are you studying the place before you arrive, or are you arriving kind of I don't know, empty and open to what you discover?
Both ways, like a little bit, of course, you try to understand a little bit about the place, but not too much like in terms of immediately what the architect has in mind about the place. I feel like more kind of in general terms of what the city or what the neighborhood or the surrounding would be like. And then I feel like if an architect did his work, like I'll see that, and that will be part of the whole documentation. So that will come out anyway in the photographs, but it gives me also like a wider view to everything around it than just the architecture.
Yeah, and I guess we have to talk a little bit about the mechanics of your work. I mean, are you traveling with a team? Are you working with a team? Do you travel with assistants? How are you shooting digital or film? I mean, all of these questions obviously come up as we look at these pictures because they're just incredible.
No, the team is very small actually. Like I work handheld, and so it's all kind of small cameras, and like for that you don't need much around it. Until March, the team was also a little bit the family around it. Like I work with my partner Jessica Collins, and we have two little kids who we took also everywhere, and au pair. So it was a whole flying circus in that sense. But we kind of raised the kids in many different places in that sense. But like the photography part itself is just me, and yeah, like during those when you're shooting in a place, like you're very much open and observant of everything what's happening around it, and I feel like with a larger team or the architects or others around it, like it diminishes also like how open and I can be to whatever is happening around it.
So all of these aerial photographs we're seeing now, are these part of a particular project?
No, these are just some examples of different places around the world which I visited, and very specific cities, and how these cities were built, and where how I was fascinated with these places. And I can go quickly through them here. Like this is, for instance, Kyoto, Japan, with the imperial gardens and the palace, and then these super blocks kind of in the city, and then like incredible pixelation of the city around it. So also these juxtapositions of places. Here Tokyo with its waterways and this completely organic structure of the city. And then what's interesting when you see that from above, like it's a small step to go like to a slum here in in the outskirts of Nairobi, Kenya. This is Kibera, one of the largest informal settlements, and that's like, in a way it almost feels like a Tokyo from above, but maybe like 100 years in development before, but also like this kind of continuous corrugated steel roofs with little alleys, but also completely organic way the city developed.
So thinking about, I guess, the ways in which you share your work, and we're going to get on to the book projects, but then also you're shooting for magazines, and you've also been asked to teach at times, and you obviously the number of places you've been, and the ways in which you've been able to see and document the built environment. There's so much to share, and there's so much to talk about. So As we go into the next series of slides, maybe you can tell us a bit how these book projects began.
Yeah. This was a project I did 10 years ago with Lars Müller, the Swiss publisher, on Brasilia and Chandigarh, these two cities, completely built and planned by architects Le Corbusier and Oscar Niemeyer. And that was for me like also like a completely open discovery basically in these two cities, and showing how people live there and really use the architecture as a kind of background on everyday life, what people do there, how they live in these places.
Is the title Living Modernism? Is that right?
Living with Modernity. Yeah, actually I forgot to pick it here. I have it here in the back. It's this book, Brasilia Chandigarh, Living with Modernity. So it's basically one large photo essay throughout these two cities, with in the middle an essay by this Dutch writer, Cees Noteboom, well-known travel writer, who also visited those places. But like in many images, I hardly show the architecture also, and it's really sort of trying to show, yeah, how these places are completely taken over like 50, 60 years after the architects have left, and that people just figure out ways to live in places, and like every nook and corner and cranny is used, and often in very different ways than an architect had imagined it at the time. And I'm really fascinated also by that aspect of architecture and building, and like what happens when an architect has left, and when they like their control and planning is out the door, and just everyday life in these places.
There is a lot about the friction between real life and the ideal or the utopian, right? Especially in these pictures. We think about Le Corbusier's hand and Niemeyer's vision, and the ways in which so much has been tried they've tried to control, right? So much of the landscape, and building a whole city is quite a dream for an architect, but then they could have never imagined how it would be used in the future. So is this a project initiated by Lars Müller, or is this a project that came out of your documentation?
We kind of started working on it together. We wanted to do a project, and we came up with this idea. It was also the moment that of the 50th or like around the 50th anniversary of the Brasilia, the inauguration of the city. So we thought it would be interesting to look at these two places and compare these two places visually. And this was another book project I worked on together with Urban Think Tank, where it actually didn't really start as a book project, but I visited Caracas in 2010 for the first time. That was actually for an exhibition at the MoMA at the time, and like I was photographing in a lot of different places around the world, and one of them was this cable car system in Caracas, which Urban Think Tank designed, which kind of connected these favelas, the barrios surrounding the city with the center of the city. And Caracas is a place where 60-70% of the population basically lives in these self-built structures everywhere.
Right.
And when I first visited, I saw this tower there in the center of the city. Was the second tallest building in the city, never finished. Was just a construction site, 45 stories. Just the concrete slabs, and that was it. And since
it was incomplete because of the economic kind of collapse.
Yes, So they started construction in 70s or mid 70s and 70s, and then with the economic collapse, it was never finished. It was supposed to be the headquarters of the largest bank, went bankrupt, and it stood empty for many years. And since it's a place where everyone needs to find some kind of livable space or build some kind of livable space outside any kind of regulations, and they started invading this construction site and built inside the construction site basically their own houses. And at a certain point, like 3,000 people were living inside that construction site.
Wow.
In a completely self-built.
And this is the Torre David, correct?
Yes. Yeah.
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 So this is quite a case study for improvised housing, because it's a kind of vertical favela. And I think it's something
Totally.
like 45 stories without elevators and
yeah.
Without, tell us how you, in a sense, gained access, because there is something about, and I know your work with improvised cities and dwellings has been broadly documented and discussed and debated, even critiqued and criticized at times. But there is something about you as a kind of European male having this sort of privileged access to places like this. And I just wonder, you know, what is that like when you arrive, and how are you greeted by the community, and how do you even describe why you're there?
Yeah. Of course, that's very different per place, but here it took a long time actually to get access. And like we had someone from Urban Think Tank who went there many times before to convince the people that like we were generally interested in the way they constructed kind of outside any planning or government kind of their own city in that way. And in the end they gave us a full access, and we could see everything there. But it's very different, these things. But I feel also like always what I said before, like that once you express your interest in how people live in these places, and especially places they build themselves, and I see that in the full spectrum, like from architects like who invite you to their place and want to have a document, to these kind of informal places where people also build it all by their with their own hands, and they're very proud of what they built and what they made. And like there might be still, of course, many challenges with these places to live, and there's very many shortcomings. But at the same time, like they also want to show that kind of to others. And I must say, like I've been invited in so many totally different settings always, and people are most of the time extremely welcoming, and once you express that interest, they give you kind of carte blanche to see and document their places.
Yeah, to help them tell their story, I suppose.
Yeah.
So how are they moving between 45 floors? I'm just wondering how this is even possible.
No, so that was interesting. Like there's this parking structure which is connected to the tower, a 15-story parking structure, and there's like all these kind of very specific services which started happening around that project. So like there were people who lived there in the building and saw the need to bring stuff up and down. Like there's no elevators or anything. It's your 45-story walk up basically. But then like there were these services starting in the parking garage, just taxis driving the whole day up and down the parking garage. So you have people and goods and so which were transported between those floors, already part of the floors, of course, not all the way up. But then all these
the elevator.
Exactly. Yeah. And then like people starting little businesses on every floor, so you don't have to go all the way down to buy your bread or your milk, but you just buy it in the corner store on the 20th floor where you live. And so there's this whole sort of living organism was starting to happen everywhere in the tower.
I guess I'm fascinated by the ways in which you begin as a photographer commissioned by the elite, the world's top architects, and then you find yourself in situations like this where you initiate a personal project that's about documenting the reality of life in a building that could be described as failed architecture, to use the words of probably a mutual friend of ours in in Amsterdam. And then on the other hand, right, this project then goes back into the world of the elite as it's taught through academia as a case study for improvised, the successes and I guess real conditions of improvised architecture. So it's fascinating, this sort of cycle of how many ways you can tell this story and how important it is that these stories are told.
Yeah, but like I never saw also such a big difference between these two worlds. People tell like it's two very different worlds, but like if you go back like to the CCTV images in a way, like it's also like the total everyday life of the migrant workers and the people who built a place like that, with the architecture kind of in the background, and these kind of more personal stories on how people live in these very different circumstances were always sort of my fascination also before I started working with architects. And that for me, like the architecture became also kind of a vehicle to like expand that reach of places where I could go and show definitely these juxtapositions and the large inequalities which are happening, of course, everywhere, but documented also in basically give it the same voice almost, that full spectrum.
Yeah. And you were awarded the Golden Lion at Venice for this project, if I'm not.
So we presented this in 2012 at the Venice Biennial, together with Urban Think Tank, and we got indeed the Golden Lion, and then the book was also produced from there. And those are really nice projects where you have really the time, of course, also to investigate the place, go there many times over a longer period of time. And whereas, of course, most like really commissioned architecture projects, they fly you in for a building when it's just finished or just before it's finished, and it's of course a little bit different, but it's great to see like that full spectrum in a way.
So for this level of such a complex project with such complex interaction between you and the inhabitants, how many trips did you take to fully document it and produce the book?
I think I went there maybe in total 5 times or so, and then it was different, like sometimes like we went there just in for a day or two. Like of course here it was also like it was a tense political situation in Venezuela also already at that time, so sometimes it was difficult to get in there. I also stayed there for a few nights, like overnight in the tower, to really see the full cycle of life in a way, like in a place like that. So all kind of different levels of involvement.
I know that when I've worked in the field in communities around the world, other than my own, of course, I'm often asked the question of what is returned to the community, right? There's a kind of, we could be accused of a kind of cultural extraction, right? Totally. And so I wonder in this case, how you shared the final project with these people, if you had the opportunity to.
Yeah, no, like what I try to do, what we did, for instance, here also, like I feel like in a way, like it's what I always try to do, like when I'm in these places, is also show kind of different examples to these people, like how people live in other places, like they're fascinated also to see that aspect. But then also like in the end, like we organized a small exhibition also here on the ground floor of the Torre David, showing sort of our point of view back to their community. And then they like it's always like when you come there as an outsider, yeah, you see it also like with different eyes, and it's also often an eye opener for them to recognize and see a place in a different way, and to give it also like an importance.
Absolutely. Fascinating. So I guess we're moving on to your more recent projects.
Yeah, I thought it would be nice to finish with two books which just came out. Like from both books I got actually this week the first copies really. This one is a book I've worked on over a long time. Like it's the first pictures I started doing them 5 years ago with Silvia Benedito. She's a professor at Harvard at the GSD, also in landscapes, and she was really interested. She did this large research study on atmospheres, landscapes, architecture, and how that kind of almost kind of can create microclimates around specific places. So she had picked a number of sites all around the world, from very historic places to modern architecture, and did studies around these projects on these kind of microclimates and atmospheres and so. For me, like often it was very little real architecture work, but also like more describing a place and like a weather condition and the surroundings of that place. But a really nice different way to look at places.
Absolutely. I remember when I was at the GSD, your name came up and I wondered, were you actually teaching or co-teaching a studio there?
Yes, I did. What was it? A year and a half ago, a studio, no, almost 2 years ago already, a studio with Tatiana Bilbao there, an option studio. And I come there once in a while, like for shorter workshops and so, which is often easier to organize than a real studio. For me, it's often difficult to make that commitment to be in one place every week, because my schedule is kind of so scattered usually around the world.
And we'll finish with a larger project that you've done with Tatiana Bilbao through Yale. So let's talk about the atmospheres. So these are different places you visited around the world?
So this is, for instance, in Chile, this amazing project by Chilean architect Germán del Sol. And it's this natural springs, basically, where this incredibly hot, almost boiling water comes out of the earth and creates these natural springs there in a gorge in a valley in the south of Chile. And the only intervention, basically, what he did there is this kind of, you see it here a little bit from above, this red path throughout this valley, where people walk on and then from there step into all these different paths. And I was there in winter, in Chilean winter, so like there's snow on the ground, but at the same time, like it's all boiling and steaming. The surroundings are like snowy, but like just that valley is like suddenly a kind of tropical place, because it's always warm there, and a completely different climate just in that small valley, where like this incredible lush growth, of course. And then people taking their baths, and it's a very open place. Like, it's been featured in many architecture destinations, but at the same time, like, it's a place where like everyone from the village just goes there during the week or in the weekend to take a bath, and a very open democratic place in a way.
Mm. The contrast is striking.
Yeah. Or this is, for instance, Barragan's gardens and parks, and so in Mexico City, where she did one part of her research on. This is Paris, the Jardin Bamboo, this incredible bamboo garden in the middle of Paris. So very different sites which she researched. So here, Paley Park in New York, for instance, this tiny pocket park in Midtown with all the bustling Manhattan around it, and then suddenly you're in this sitting literally in the middle of this incredible waterfall, which creates kind of microclimate in the middle of Manhattan.
Yeah. So in a sense, these are all like oases, right? Where
in a way, yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, and this is, for instance, Caracas, the university there, another one of these studies. Chandigarh came also back there, how the city was designed there, and how like also like shading was a very important part of the whole city design in all kind of different ways, from walkways to the streets to the larger design of the city. Here we're in the UK, the Rousham Gardens, these incredibly manicured gardens and hedges, and the way they were situated to create kind of microclimates on one side of a hedge versus the other side, the waterways in between, how water was distributed through these gardens, and so on. Incredible fruit walls where fruit grows against these walls. And then probably the most extraordinary place in that sense, where it's really like the clash of climates, is Sea Ranch in the north of California. Which was when the architects started there, Charles Moore and Lawrence Harpen, the landscape architect, in the 60s. It was a completely barren landscape, which they really cultivated and made it into this incredible place, where kind of landscape, the trees, the buildings all kind of mimic a kind of similar mood and almost architecture and feel, where all that comes together.
Beautiful. How landscape influences architecture, and
yeah,
and vice versa, in a sense.
But you see also here, like in these aerial photographs, you really can start to understand, how landscape, architecture, climate, and literally there in that place, of course, it's always this clash of climates, of the land climate of California coming together with, the sea of the Pacific, and merging there in the trees. In the landscape.
Iwan, I'd love for you to take us quickly through the Two Sides project with
Yes.
Tatiana Bilbao.
Let me
still have some time for questions.
Yes. So that's the other book. That's was a project Tatiana Bilbao initiated with 11 universities in the US and Mexico, and each university, each studio picked one specific spot. You see them here kind of all together in Mexico, where you saw kind of the American influence in Mexico or the Mexican influence in America, and a number of sites around the border. And we really want to document that full landscape of the Americas and how these two cities, and of course with all the rhetoric of the border and
Yeah.
like Trump at the time, like we started this project 2 years ago. The book just came out actually, but at the time, of course, like all the border rhetoric was like so amplified, and we thought it would be really interested to look at these two. The two sides of the border. What the book is called also.
To understand the commonalities, right, and how really borders are man-made and
man-made and totally fluid, porous in a way, in terms of how IDs and people and place and everything kind of merges at the same time. And like this border is almost a kind of made-up thing, of course. Literally, the border here, this iron wall in the middle, crossing through backyards of people, crossing through landscapes, and two very different worlds. Here we're on the most eastern side of the border, Reynosa, McAllen, Texas. The Mexican side, which became just this incredible dumping ground of everything.
Wow.
There, one of the studios looked at where remittance monies went from Mexicans who worked in the US, who sent often large part of their salaries back to Mexico. They traced like where that remittance money goes to, and when you visit these sites where most of the remittance money from the US goes to, in the Mexican countryside, you see this completely transformed landscape.
Yeah.
So Mexicans who live there in the US, they send money back, but to their families, of course, but also like often with ideas like build our future home for whenever we come back to Mexico. So they send money to buy concrete, to buy steel, to buy materials for their ideal future homes, but also like ideas of what these homes should look like. So they come with sketches of things they see in the US, and that gets built by a family member, a nephew, niece, there in Mexico in the countryside. So it's this incredible landscape of these kind of fantasy homes, which are also never really finished, like they're in perpetuous construction almost.
It's a kind of correspondence architecture, huh?
Totally, yeah. With like architectural details from all over the place kind of merged into one.
Oh, fascinating.
Sometimes like here, like the Japanese influences, or all kind of McMansions appearing everywhere there in the countryside.
I love it. Iwan, I guess we'd love to open it up to questions at this point.
Yes,
if you don't mind.
Sure.
I'm just having a quick look through the chat, and I will begin to collect some questions here. It looks like our first question is from Christina Panchik. Christina, if you're there, would you like to ask your question directly to Iwan? Not sure if she's still with us. So Christina's wondering, how do you manage to capture all these amazing perspectives of the process? And obviously this is a very straightforward question, but she's asking about whether or not you're in a helicopter. And so we've touched upon that. But you're not only in a helicopter, you're also in the building itself. I think she's referring to the CCTV images.
Yeah.
But are there other ways that maybe we're unaware of that you're actually managing to take these pictures?
Yeah, it's always kind of the full spectrum of access, like from helicopters, from planes, to just ringing doorbells on neighboring buildings, walking around in places, often I rent a bike, for instance, in places where you just bike around to see to get more a connection with a place and the street life, and so it's kind of the full spectrum, and it depends a little bit on the place what works best. But yeah.
Natasha Aurora is wondering, Natasha, are you there? Would you like to ask your question directly to Iwan?
Hello from Montreal. Thanks, Stephen. This is so amazing. I knew exactly how amazing it was going to be. Iwan, I had some thoughts as you were going through your pictures, but I don't know how to refer back to them without the pictures. Anyways, which question were you referring to, Stephen? Hold on.
You were wondering about the experiences, the lived experiences of the children.
In Brasilia, right? Somewhere in Brazil. Yeah. Do you get to know the so-called protagonists in your pictures? I mean, maybe you spend more time than an instinctual moment with, by taking the snap. I know you spent the night, I think, in that space, that 45 floor tower. Do you get to know who these people are, and maybe these kids, because they're probably deeply influenced by the space as they grow up? I don't know. Do you know what they become, or do they end up to have a better life and be influenced by space and utility, and I don't know, become better citizens as a result of? It's not an all-marketed question. It's more like.
Thank you, Natasha. Not provoking.
I'm going to unmute right now.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, like you try to connect with people. There's all kind of different levels of involvement, of course, in places, and sometimes you can talk with people. Sometimes, like, it has to go through translators, of course. But it's important to ask questions in places like that, and it's also like what I was saying earlier, like as a photographer, you always have a reason kind of to be in a place and to ask these questions, and then one thing often leads to another. They introduce you to other people, and that's kind of how these projects also start and come about. And then with some of them, you keep in touch and you send back, like, once a book gets published, or you send a photograph back or so. People, of course, love to see how, like, someone from such a different perspective sees their place, and what interests me in their place.
Absolutely. And okay, I can go on about this, but that's fine. I totally understand.
Thank you, Natasha. We have another question from Malika. Malika, are you there? Would you like to ask your question directly to Iwan?
Hi. Hello, can you hear me, everyone? Okay.
Yes.
Thank you, Iwan, Stephen. Such an amazing, look into your career and your photographs. I was curious because, I was on a call with Michael Murphy from Mass Design last night, and we were talking about how spaces and places are so fundamental to our experience in life, and also how we shape our own identity. And obviously around the world, it's also a very cultural experience, right? The way that different cultures inhabit spaces are so different. Or maybe they're not. Maybe your experience in going and traveling, you realize that people are all actually a lot more similar than we think. But I'm curious, in your, now that you are in the realm of architecture, but you might not have been growing up, how has this exposure or this engagement to the built environment made you think and reflect about your past and some of the spaces in your childhood that were influential to you, and maybe where do you see those influences appear in your life now as an adult? Thank you.
That's interesting. Yeah, thank you. Like, it was interesting. Like, my childhood was kind of the opposite in many ways. I grew up here in the Netherlands, and I don't think I took a plane until I was like 18 or 19 years old. So that was the first time I actually flew. Like, I grew up here in Europe, and like the trips we made were just trips by car or by train within Europe. So my world was very small up to that point. And the moment I could get out, I went out, and for me it was a fascination to see suddenly the whole rest of the part of the world. But that's like, in a way, I think like I never considered that as a handicap, that I wasn't able to see a lot before, or didn't have that experience as a child. I think as a young kid, like you take it for granted, that environment around you, and that was totally fine for me. And I think that was that's also something you see now, that like people can create any kind of living condition for themselves, around themselves, and it's totally fine and totally normal for them. And I think that to document that full spectrum from these people who are living in very difficult, very complicated circumstances, and have to build a place, create a place for themselves out of almost nothing, up to the other side of the end of the spectrum. And you're like in the sort of most opulent home, architects designed home, in a way, like people find a place suitable for themselves and create it for themselves. And that's that kind of normalcy of a place is something I try to capture, and it can be that full spectrum.
Wow. Well, listen, Iwan, this has been quite an incredible conversation. And look, all of the pictures are so fascinating. We could spend hours. And I'm looking forward to continuing our conversations offline as well. Thank you so much for this. I'd like to remind everyone that next Wednesday, my co-host Glenn Adamson will be in conversation with Rick Kaufman, founder of Art Industry. Once again, thanks to Iwan Baan for sharing his world with us.
Thanks, it was great to be here, and hope to see you soon again.
All right. Wishing everybody a good weekend. This has been Design and Dialogue. Thank you.